John Stuart Mill, Utilitarianism. Turning to the third to the fifth chapters of John Stuart Mill's work, after discussing what utilitarian is and introducing the greatest happiness principle, which Mill talks about in terms of using his notion of the principle of utility, this is the same as the greatest happiness principle for him, he raises a question about this principle of utility, the greatest happiness principle. And it's a legitimate question which you could ask. Why should I be bound to promote the happiness of all? And I think, this is kind of the question which the egoist would raise. I should just promote my self-interest. Why should I promote everyone else's? So part of the problem here is also the secondary principles seem to have a stronger moral appeal, right? So I know that murder is wrong, that I shouldn't steal, right? But I just feel better sitting in my house, and I'm really not interested in promoting other people's happiness. So Mill responds to this with the following statements. First of all, he says, look, this is not a problem just for utilitarianism, getting people to conform to these theories and these ideas. These are problems for all theories, so we shouldn't just think that this is a problem for utilitarianism. He notes also, which is kind of a questionable response, that as we get smarter and kind of wise up to our social responsibilities, we recognize that the primary principle applies, so we should, and we recognize, in other words, as we get more socially aware, that we should promote other people's happiness, okay? Of course, you could respond and say, well, I'm not sure about that. I think as you get wiser, you realize you should kind of move away from people. So this could be questionable. And he says utilitarianism recognizes the sanctions that tend to motivate us to do right and wrong. So I think this last one becomes his most powerful response to this, because, well, we can talk about moral conscience and stuff and why we do things and why we refuse to do things. And his basic, morally speaking, that is, and his basic argument here is that, well, the greatest happiness principle is kind of the basis for our doing these things and for doing good and abstaining from wrong. Okay, so this is kind of the answer to why we would promote other person's happiness. So let's look at these types of sanctions. So there are two types, the internal and external. First of all, there's conscience. Now, I think, persons who lack a conscience, we often call sociopaths or psychopaths, right? Normal persons have a conscience, and they will feel sympathy and compassion, for example, when someone else is hurt. And we feel a conscience in the sense that when we wrong someone, we feel guilty for that reason. So this is a type of sanction that seems to encourage us to at least consider other person's happiness. There's the external sanctions as well, that when we do wrong things, our family is not very happy with us, for example, friends, and of course our citizens who impose punishments upon us through laws. There's also religion, which has these sanctions, and many people are religious, some are not. And might have other feelings that are similar to this but not religious, that, well, we feel like it would be wrong and that God would be displeased and that there's damnation, etc. So those are certainly external sanctions that some people are bound by, but beyond that, there are certainly the civil sanctions of family, friends, and citizens. So the question is specified a little more. Considering utilitarianism to be a form of hedonism, if we are seeking pleasure, then really, how can we explain these moral sentiments? Because let's accept this and say, okay, well, this explains that we have some sort of social responsibility to at least consider other person's happiness, these sanctions. So, but what about these particular sentiments that are at root to these sanctions that we feel, these moral sentiments? Well, how could you explain that then? And so Mill responds, well, these sentiments, and I think this is a very interesting response, given that much of moral theory, especially post-evolutionary theory, is very egoistic, in the sense that we're all seeking self-interest. Mill's going to say look, these sentiments are kind of evolved. They're innate to human nature, and not just means at birth, like instincts. They're outgrowths of our nature. But look, we're not just self-interested individual animals. Again, we're not snakes. We are human beings, and as human beings, we have evolved to be social animals, and we therefore have social instincts. And so the idea that everyone seeks their own self-interest, maybe that works as a human society, that the human society seeks its self-interest over promoting the interests, let's say, of the society of certain birds. But as a society, we don't individually seek our self-interest, but rather we socially seek the interest of both ourself and society. So this is a kind of, you could say this is a rejection of egoism, the idea that, my self-interest is primary, or you could say it's a kind of espousal of certain social egoism, but you could extend it because you can start to talk about the rights of animals, and that, as conscious entities, they have pleasure and pain, and they can sort of participate in this idea of what our society is, including our planet. So you can include that and kind of reject egoism wholesale from utilitarian theories, which is interesting because it is a hedonistic pleasure in which you can actually reject egoism, whereas most hedonistic, it's a hedonistic theory, that is. Most hedonistic theories kind of get stuck with egoism. Why? Because if we're seeking to please ourselves, then we're always seeking it for ourselves and our own self-interest, but not for utilitarianism. So Mill notes also that these types of sentiments should be nurtured through education and laws. We should nurture our children to be civil and to kind of to nourish these particular instincts to be to have these social moral sentiments for others. So, moving on to the next chapter of the work, he asks the question: Can we prove then the greatest happiness principle? And you'll notice that these last sections are all focused on giving a basis for this principle of utility, or this greatest happiness principle, which is the foundation of utilitarianism. So he's going to say, no, you cannot prove it. And his response is, but this isn't a problem, because if we look at other disciplines, we see that not all principles are susceptible to proof, in other words, can be proved, nor need they be proved. For example, in mathematics, which is the most certain of all sciences, mathematics has certain, at least classically speaking, has certain principles which it doesn't prove, which it calls axioms. These axioms are considered indemonstrable. For example, a famous axiom from Euclid was his fifth parallel postulate that, well, if we take parallel lines and we run them forever, they will never meet because they're parallel. Okay, so the principle of utility, he says, which is the greatest happiness principle, is pretty much like this. You can't prove it because it's kind of self-evident. We just know that we should be promoting other person's happiness. It's in our nature to do so, and so no other proof can be given. But he does say a kind of quasi-proof can be, however, which is not really a proof, and we're going to see why, but it is kind of an indication through kind of empirical evidence that, well, the greatest happiness principle does kind of apply. Let's look at this quasi-proof for the greatest happiness principle. So the first statement is that everyone desires happiness. Okay, so this is an assumption. In other words, it's a statement we kind of are putting down without proving it, but he's actually going to prove it in the second premise here, and he says this is evident from the fact that we all seek happiness. Okay, so we all desire happiness. What's the proof of this? Look around you. Everyone seeks happiness. So this is a kind of inductive argument. In other words, we're looking at particular instances, and we are inferring a general principle on the basis of that. So that's a procedure of induction, which is called in logic. Moving to the third principle, every person's happiness is a benefit to that person. Obviously, for me, it's in my self-interest to be happy, and it's beneficial to me. For you, it's the same thing. Now, this being the case, and so this becomes kind of the questionable move, but it is necessary for the greatest happiness principle, since it's about not just myself, but you and I. So the movement is this. Hence, since our own happiness is beneficial to us, then the happiness of all is beneficial to us. The idea here is that as parts, we kind of are not as great as we would be as a whole. So, and I think the idea he's kind of thinking of is that if you think of a team, when the team is not working together, right, it's not doing well. But when it is working together, it does better. So it's doing better than a team that's not working together. And the idea is that when we're working on our own to achieve happiness, well, we might be okay, but if we all work together, we're going to improve both the whole and one another. And so this is kind of his quasi-proof. Of course, that step there is a little questionable, but you kind of see the idea in that. So, of course, he's saying you really can't prove it, but this can give us kind of an idea behind it. So that's that quasi-proof. So a further objection, though, which can be leveled is, well, wait a minute. We often desire things that don't make us happy. For example, an alcoholic desires alcohol, but isn't necessarily happy on account of that. They might be ruining their lives or the lives of others on account because of this disease. So in answering this, Mill will distinguish between will and desire. And will is this active component of human, I changed that recently, human sensibility or human appetite you could use instead of desire, since that's the same. So you want to use human appetite there. In other words, you will yourself to get up for work despite being tired. By contrast, desire is the passive component of our human appetites. For example, I want to stay in bed, but I will myself to get up. So I think the distinction is clear. Now, let's look at the explanation for how this will work and how the alcoholic is actually doing something that's hurting him or herself. The alcoholic, and we presume here that the alcoholic wants to stop. Okay, so that's will there, right? Has no desire to drink. So the alcoholic who wants to stop doesn't desire to drink. There's this kind of addiction and disease that compels the alcoholic, that forces their desires, but in the end, their desires, they're kind of willing it otherwise, but they kind of can't, right? And so that's the problem. From this, John Stuart Mill gives us a kind of new definition of virtue and vice. Remember, for Aristotle, virtue is a kind of a state of character and a habit, a moral habit, and vice is the extreme between virtue as the mean. So he kind of refines it, and he says virtue is the habitual willing of what is pleasurable and what brings happiness, whereas vice is the habitual willing of what is harmful and brings unhappiness. So I think with this kind of definition, he's offering a more, let's say, complete discussion of what virtue as a habit is, in tying it to pleasure and happiness in this sense. So, some further questions about utilitarianism. Does utilitarianism come into conflict with justice, with our sense of right and wrong? Here's an example. If I kill a person, P, then Q and R, so will be happy. So, now by the hedonistic calculus, it seems that I should kill P. Why? Because the hedonistic calculus is let's calculate the expected good. The expected good is that two people will benefit. The expected bad is that one person will not. So the expected good seems to outweigh the expected bad, which means that I should kill P. But wait a minute, this just doesn't seem right? So it seems that utilitarianism based upon that calculus is conflicting with what we understand to be just and right and wrong. From that, and this is now in the 5th chapter of that work, Mill will then analyze what justice is, and in particular what justice is relative to the principle of utility. First, he identifies a number of senses. He says the just can be broken down into various senses, for example, legality, the laws of the state, morality, the basic natural laws, and our privileges and rights. Just deserts, in other words, receiving what is owed to you. It's kind of like a karma. Trust is the faith in upholding agreements with others, so someone is unjust who breaks them. Impartiality means being unbiased and unprejudiced, and tied to that is equality, meaning treating equals the same. Now, looking at this, what Mill does is he kind of takes a general case and he says, is there a sense of justice which applies to all of these things and also is rooted in our sentiments? And he identifies this in a unified notion where he says, well, in the end, justice is a form of retaliation in response to some type of harm, whether it be a perceived inequality, impartiality, some form of partiality, some form of a break of trust, lack of just deserts, immorality, and illegality. Okay, and so this seems to be the unifying notion that Mill wants to put into all these senses of justice. Then he ties this notion of justice to social sentiment. Remember, what he's trying to do is show that the principle of utility, the greatest happiness principle, does not go against justice. So in doing that, he takes this notion of justice and ties it to sentiments. He says, look, injustice results when a person's rights have been violated by someone else. So look, there's a social element there, and injustice is tied to that social element. Also, we feel sympathy for innocent persons who have been wronged. So we are naturally inclined to support this greatest happiness principle in the case of injustice. And finally, when injured by another, we expect retaliation, which is his basic understanding of what justice is, where we have this notion of law and punishment, which is used in every society in order to safeguard these wrongs. So the basic idea here is that social sentiment is the basis of justice, but social sentiment is also the basis of the greatest happiness principle. This being the case, there seems to be no conflict with justice and with the greatest happiness principle. So finally, re-examining the problem that we saw earlier, if I kill P, then Q and R will be happy. By the hedonistic calculus, I should kill P, but this can't be right. So how do we solve this? And Mill would say likely that the calculation is simply mistaken. To kill P would be to violate the just rights of P according to the notion of justice, because at some fundamental level it would be breaking away from our sense of sympathy and the basic rights that we each feel and hold and also feel towards others, and in doing so this would violate the greatest happiness principle. And so in this particular calculus, what we're doing is we're omitting the fact that we all will have some sense of sympathy and notions of basic rights for P, and so we can't just sacrifice P for that, whatever this happiness of Q and R will be in this case.